China is making it harder for its citizens. For Muslims to get into the Mecca or wherever. Another NPR path for Chinese Muslims. Reflects the extraordinary measures China is taking to keep tabs on its and prevent them from performing the Hajj, as well as the equally ingenious ways that believers circumvent their saleen for the NP caption Salah for NPR Circle. Chinese Muslims' journeys reflect China's extraordinary measures to monitor its citizens and prevent them from performing the Hajj, as well as the equally ingenious ways in which believers circumvent their salinas to get to Kuala Pradesh. Malaysia. They left their village in the blink of an eye, dropping their prayer caps and headscarves in favor of casual sportswear and silently praying that they would not be prevented from leaving China. The group of 6 of travelers were Chinese. Me intending to go to China, we could have our passports cut out or have our passports confiscated. But we will face whatever we have to do when we get back, said one of the 3 male travelers who have been in contact with this group of 6 pilgrims since May, when they set out from their village in northwest China toward the holy city in Saudi Arabia. Their winding path reflects the extraordinary measures that China is taking to monitor its citizens and prevent them from performing the Hajj, as well as the equally ingenious ways in which believers circumvent them. The NPR does not use their names or their village to protect them from official scrutiny. Since returning to China, the Chinese authorities have severely restricted the religions practiced, especially Christianity and Islam in the region. Since 2017, at least hundreds of thousands of people have been detained or arrested. At least hundreds of thousands Uyghurs of the historically Muslim ethnic minority in other parts of northwest China, provincial authorities are demolishing mosques or forcibly removing them. Arabic-style domes, closing Islamic schools and monitor religious leaders this year as travel has intensified in the wake. The virus pandemic intensified travel around the world. Chinese authorities have shut down almost all overseas travel for Muslim believers. Muslims fear that they might radicalize zero overseas or stir up religious fervor after returning to China. According to interviews with a dozen of Chinese Muslims, public security officials, public security officers have been sent to the country's airports to screen outbound travelers heading to Islamic countries, and were tasked to make calls to compel pilgrims who are already abroad to turn back and return home. Those who have performed the Hajj privately outside of their on state-sanctioned tours are detained or arrested upon when you return to China. China wants to control you even when you're outside the country, said one of the pilgrims, a Muslim cleric on the left, leads a worshipper in a special prayer after the Elijah prayer at the historic mosque. April 22 in Beijing. Kevin Cap NFIM's Chinese Muslim cleric, left, leads a worshipper in a special prayer after Al-Fajr at the historic mosque on April 22 in Beijing, China. April 22 in Beijing. Kevin FIM's receiving a passport first problem. The first problem face Hajj is getting travel. China stopped issuing new passports during the coronavirus pandemic. But in practice, restrictions remain particularly severe for an estimated 20-30 million Muslims, which is 1.5-2% of the country's total population in the northwest China's Qinghai, where pilgrims live, authorities have stopped issuing new passports altogether. Have stopped issuing new passports to residents who show up in Go Il, another predominantly Muslim ethnic group according to 7 Muslims living there. These restrictions on passport issuance echo long-standing controls in the western Chinese region, Xinjiang, where passports for ethnic Uyghurs began to be confiscated in 2016, a year before authorities began a mass arrest of ethnic Uyghurs. A year before authorities launched a campaign of detentions aimed mainly against Uyghur communities. Restrictions on passport issuance in Qinghai began after a former party secretary of Urumqi, the capital of the Xinhai region, was transferred to a position, a high-ranking party official, in Qinghai this year in Qinghai province. Those who received passports were required to sign official letters promising that they will not perform Hajj while traveling abroad. To perform Hajj, according to 3 Chinese Muslims, each of whom signed such letters, a 4th Chinese Muslim said they also had to provide a letter of enrollment letter and bank statements. Bank statements indicating that they were traveling abroad to get an education and not to Hajj. The 6 pilgrims with whom he has been in contact were lucky enough. They were able to obtain travel documents 3 years earlier by going at a passport office a few hundred miles from Qinghai province. The would-be pilgrims praying at the Jabal al-Rahma in Rafati. As Muslims continue to make the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia on June 27. June. Cape's would-be pilgrims pray at the Jabal Ara in Rafati as Muslims continue their Hajj pilgrimage at the Saudi Arabian Mecca on June 27. June Ozgan Kiro Dolo I Jeans Vega Ids. A crackdown on private Hajj tours. Passports are in hand, but the group still needed someone to organize the trip and, crucially, would be able get the Hajj visas that Saudi Arabia requires of all pilgrims. However, in the run-up to this year's pilgrimage, Chinese authorities have begun arresting of private tour leaders. Of those arrested was a tour leader named Man, who also writes on the internet about both scripture and Chinese religious politics under the pseudonym Tianfang, who was educated Islamic theologian. Ma has for the past 2 decades has led private Hajj groups for hundreds of Chinese Muslims a year. In 2019, state security officials have launched an investigation into him in his home province of Minsk in connection with his activities in organizing Hajj. In April of this year, he was arrested in the northwestern Chinese city of Lanz on charges of running an illegal business. Islam is under the protection of our country's constitution, and Hajj is the most important of the 5 pillars of Islam, wrote Morocco in a letter of appeal that has been made available to us. The official policy of our country is to administer religion in accordance with the law, but in practice, many citizens are stalked. Restrictions on legitimate religious activities, including the Hajj. China organizes state-approved tours to the Mecca. But for the pilgrims contacted, this is not an option according to pilgrims on a waiting list. Waiting list for a limited number of seats for the Hajj that Saudi Arabia allocated to Muslims in China has been for at least 5 years. In addition, China prohibits its employees from performing the Hajj, regardless of their age. Otherwise, the employees risk losing their pensions and other state benefits. Not giving up hope, the pilgrims decided to make the journey on their own, keeping in touch online with dozens of acquaintances and other Hajj travelers. To gauge the likelihood of success, was especially nervous because they had three elderly travelers. Until last year, Arabia required all pilgrims to be fully immunized against vaccine 19, and quite a few of them already 65 years old from the restrictions associated of the pandemic this year. Those age restrictions have been lifted. However, according to 4 people familiar with the policy, the Hajj policy of the state-run Islamic Association of China, which organizes approved Hajj delegations in the country, selects only pilgrims under the age of 65. The Islamic Association and the government's Department of Religious Affairs did not respond to NPR's request for comment when we received information that several other pilgrims had left the country, decided to perform the Hajj together using with our own funds, said one of the pilgrims. The group of 6 left Shanghai. The next day, Muslim pilgrims try to touch the door of the Kaaba, Islam's holiest shrine, at a large mosque in the holy city, Mecca, during the annual pilgrimage. Hajj 30. June Caption: IM's Muslim pilgrims try to touch the main door of the Kaaba, of Islam's holiest shrine in a large mosque in the holy city of Mecca during the annual Hajj pilgrimage on June 30. Siha IM's a long and winding road. The group did not fly directly to Saudi Arabia because previous travelers told them that doing so would reveal to Chinese security officials that they were Hajj pilgrims instead. The group first booked tickets to the southern city of Guangzhou, a major international transit hub. As soon as once they landed, police officers from their hometown called one of them on his cell phone and inquired whether they were leaving Na province and whether they were planning if they were going to perform Hajj. The group replied to the police that they were traveling for work, then disconnected their cell phones. In a panic, the group decided to fly to central China, passing through 2 more domestic airports before flying to Malaysia, a Muslim country in Southeast Asia. Each time they went through security checks at the airport, they said they tried to remain silent. Of other pilgrims, they heard that security personnel from Qinghai province, were stationed at airports all over China to pick up on their regional accent. 2 other Chinese Muslims traveled abroad during the Hajj last year, said they were stopped by police officers specially assigned to Chinese airports when the officers checked their identification cards, which showed them as a group of historically Islamic travelers, were taken aside for questioning about whether they were traveling if they were going to Hajj to hide their faith. The group took off their chedros and put on new sportswear bought the day before. I felt almost naked, said one of the elderly, a traveler in public since she was a child. One of the immigration officials noticed that her travel documents indicated her ethnicity, Hui ethnicity, on her travel documents. She said she was going on vacation and was let through. When they landed in Malaysia, the group went straight to one of the largest mosques in Kuala Lumpur. There, surrounded by reminders of Islamic piety, the tension of the last week had taken its toll, and Muslims visit Al-Masjid an-Nabawi to pray after completing of the Hajj pilgrimage in Medina, Saudi Arabia. Arabia on July 2. July 2, Muslims visit Al-Masjid Aba to pray after completing the Hajj pilgrimage in Medina, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's 2nd. July 2 overseas surveillance from Malaysia. The group flew to a row in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, but they knew they weren't safe there either. Safe there either, according to 3 Chinese Muslims even after leaving China. The Hajj travelers continue to receive phone calls. Threatening phone calls from local police officers, demanding their immediate return. A group of pilgrims from Qinghai was discouraged to learn upon landing that 4 travelers from their hometown were forced to return to China from Aliad after being threatened with punishment. Chinese police threatened to punish the family's multi-armed surveillance reflects the harassment and threats on the internet, which according to representatives of the Uyghur diaspora say they regularly receive from Chinese security authorities, even after fleeing China. While in Saudi Arabia, a group of 6 pilgrims agreed to remove batteries from their Chinese smartphones for fear that security personnel in China could track their movements on the devices, or that they would receive even more threatening phone calls. They were worried that they would have to find a private driver willing to take them to the Mecca city in Saudi Arabia, where the Prophet Muhammad delivered his last sermon, and which is the pinnacle of the annual journey, because they didn't have the official Hajj visas and passes required to pass through checkpoints in June. They successfully completed the 2-week Hajj by going around the Kaaba, the black-colored cubic building in the Mecca. Now they faced the prospect of returning home, where they awaiting punitive consequences in Qinghai. We must trust that we will overcome all the obstacles we have to overcome, said one of the pilgrims. We don't have a plan, we take one step forward and then meet the next.